Most people think they know what caused the Second World War. They'll tell you it was one man, one angry, screaming dictator who hypnotized an entire nation and dragged the world into chaos. And sure, that man played a role. Nobody is denying that. But if that's where your understanding of the Second World War begins and ends, then you've only read the final chapter of a much longer, much darker, much more uncomfortable story. Because the truth is, the Second World War didn't begin in 1939 when German tanks rolled across the Polish border. It didn't begin with a failed painter from Austria giving fiery speeches in Munich beer halls. It didn't even begin with the rise of a single political party. The seeds of the deadliest conflict in human history were planted decades earlier in a conference room in Paris, where the victors of the First World War sat around a table and wrote what they believed was a peace treaty, but was, in reality, a ticking time bomb. What followed was a chain of events so tangled, so riddled with greed, cowardice, broken promises, and backroom deals that it makes the simple version of history feel almost naive. This is a story about money as much as it is about ideology, about bankers as much as it is about generals, about the decisions made in boardrooms in New York and London that were just as devastating as any military campaign. So let me take you back, not to the battlefields of 1939, but to the treaty that made the war inevitable and the people, the institutions, and the empires that let it happen. Let's begin in the summer of 1919 in the grand halls of the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. The First World War had finally ended. Over 17 million people were dead. Entire cities across Europe lay in rubble. An entire generation of young men had been buried in the mud of French trenches. The survivors were broken, physically and psychologically. And the leaders of Britain, France, and the United States gathered not just to celebrate their victory, but to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. The problem was, they couldn't agree on how to do that. On one side of the table, you had the French. Their country had been the main battlefield for 4 years. Northern France was practically a wasteland. Entire towns had been erased from the map. And so French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, a man so fierce they called him the Tiger, wanted one thing above all else: revenge. He wanted Germany weakened so severely, so permanently, that it could never threaten France again. He wanted to strip Germany of its military, seize its territory, and bury it under a mountain of debt so high it could never climb out. On the other side, you had American President Woodrow Wilson, who came to Paris with a very different vision. Wilson was an idealist. He believed in self-determination, open diplomacy, and a new international order built on cooperation, not punishment. His famous 14 points were meant to be a blueprint for lasting peace. He wanted a League of Nations, a body where countries would talk instead of fight. And he genuinely believed that if you punished Germany too harshly, you'd plant the seeds of the next war. And then there was British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, stuck in the middle. Personally, he understood Wilson's logic, but he just won a general election at home with slogans like "Make Germany Pay," and the British public, still burying their sons, was in no mood for mercy. Lloyd George had to balance what he thought was right with what his people demanded. And in the end, political survival won. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, and it was, by almost every measure, a catastrophe disguised as a peace agreement. First, there was Article 231, the infamous war guilt clause. The single paragraph placed the entire blame for the First World War squarely on Germany and its allies. Not shared blame, not conditional blame, total, absolute guilt. And that mattered, because this clause was the legal justification for everything that followed. Germany was forced to accept astronomical reparations, eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent of roughly $33 billion at the time. To put that in perspective, that figure was roughly 3 times Germany's entire national income. Economists immediately screamed that the number was not just punitive, it was impossible. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist who had actually attended the peace conference as an advisor, was so horrified by the terms that he resigned from the delegation and wrote a book about it. In The Economic Consequences of the Peace, Keynes warned that the reparations would not only cripple Germany, but would destabilize all of Europe. He predicted that crushing Germany economically would breed resentment so deep that it would inevitably lead to another war. Almost nobody listened, but the reparations were only the beginning. Germany was stripped of roughly 13% of its European territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. Large chunks of eastern Germany were carved off to create or enlarge Poland. The coal-rich Saar Basin was placed under international administration for 15 years. All of Germany's overseas colonies, territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, were seized and redistributed amongst the victors under the pretense of League of Nations mandates. The German military was gutted. The army was limited to just 100,000 men, a laughable number for a nation of 60 million. The Navy was reduced to a handful of ships. Submarines were banned entirely. The Air Force was dissolved. Germany was forbidden from manufacturing tanks, heavy artillery, or military aircraft. And the Rhineland, a strategically vital strip of territory along Germany's western border, was to be permanently demilitarized, meaning Germany couldn't station troops in its own backyard. Now imagine you're an ordinary German citizen in 1919. You've just survived the most devastating war in human history. You're hungry, you're exhausted. You may have lost a father, a brother, a son, and your government, the new, fragile Weimar Republic that replaced the Kaiser, has just signed a document that says you and your country are solely to blame for the entire war. That you must pay a debt so large it might take generations to clear. That your nation's army is essentially being dissolved. That your borders are being redrawn by foreigners. That the territories where your grandparents lived now belong to someone else. How would you feel? French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, one of the architects of Allied victory, looked at the treaty and said something chilling. He reportedly warned that this was not a peace, but an armistice for 20 years. He was right, almost to the day, because the treaty didn't just create economic hardship. It created a narrative, a story that told every German man, woman, and child that their suffering wasn't the result of losing a war, but was the result of being stabbed in the back, betrayed from within. This stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefield, but had been undermined by politicians, communists, and Jews who signed the armistice, became the founding mythology of a generation. It was a lie, of course. Germany's military situation in late 1918 was untenable. Their allies were collapsing. Their supply lines were severed. American reinforcements were flooding in by the hundreds of thousands. But the myth persisted because it served a purpose, and because the treaty made it so easy to believe. The immediate consequences of Versailles hit like a sledgehammer. Germany had already been economically devastated by 4 years of total war. Now it was being asked to pay billions in reparations, while simultaneously losing the industrial territories and natural resources it needed to generate that wealth. The new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was born into this impossible situation. It was like handing someone a bucket and telling them to bail out the ocean. By 1922, the situation was becoming desperate. Germany was falling behind on its reparation payments. France, under Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, lost patience. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, and occupied it. The idea was simple. If Germany wouldn't pay, France would take what it was owed directly from the coal mines and factories. The German government responded by calling for passive resistance. Workers in the Ruhr went on strike. 2 million people stopped working, bringing the region's industry to a halt. The government, already strapped for cash, decided to keep paying these striking workers by doing the one thing it should never have done. It printed money. Massive, catastrophic amounts of money. What followed was one of the most surreal episodes in economic history. Hyperinflation hit Germany like a tidal wave. In January 1923, $1 was worth roughly 17,000 German marks. By November of that same year, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. The currency became so worthless that people literally used banknotes as wallpaper. Workers were paid twice a day so they could rush out and spend their wages before the money lost its value by lunch. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. Lifetime savings, pensions, everything that the German middle class had worked for was wiped out in a matter of months. The hyperinflation of 1923 didn't just destroy the economy. It destroyed something far more dangerous to lose: trust. Trust in the government. Trust in democracy. Trust in the very idea that the system could protect ordinary people. And when people lose that trust, they don't just sit quietly. They look for someone to blame. And they look for someone who promises to fix it, no matter how extreme those promises might be. It was in this climate of rage and despair that a 34-year-old agitator launched his first bid for power. In November 1923, in a beer hall in Munich, a man tried to overthrow the regional government in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It failed spectacularly. The man was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to prison. But the trial gave him a national platform. He used his time in prison to write a book that outlined his vision for Germany, a vision built on racial supremacy, territorial expansion, and the total rejection of the Versailles Treaty. The man, of course, was Adolf Hitler, and the book was Mein Kampf. But here's the part most people don't talk about, the part that makes the comfortable version of history deeply uncomfortable. While Germany was spiraling into economic chaos, the response from the international community wasn't to help Germany rebuild in any meaningful, sustainable way. It was to use Germany's desperation as a business opportunity. In 1924, the Dawes Plan was introduced, named after American banker Charles Dawes. On the surface, it looked like a rescue package. Germany's annual reparation payments were restructured to be more manageable, starting at 1 billion gold marks and rising gradually. And to kickstart the economy, A massive loan of 800 million gold marks was arranged, mostly through American banks. J.P. Morgan floated the loan on the American market, and it was oversubscribed almost immediately. The money did bring temporary relief. German industry revived. Unemployment fell. The mid to late 1920s became known as the Golden Age of the Weimar Republic. Culture flourished. Berlin became one of the most vibrant cities in the world, and it seemed, for a brief, shining moment, like democracy might actually take root. But the recovery was an illusion built on borrowed money. Here's how the system actually worked. American banks loaned money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations to Britain and France, then used those reparation payments to repay their own war debts to the United States. It was a circular flow of capital that looked productive on paper, but was essentially just the same money going around and around. And at every stop, bankers took their cut. The Dawes Plan was followed in 1929 by the Young Plan, which reduced total reparations to about 36 billion Reichsmarks, payable over 59 years, with the final installment due in 1988. Think about that for a moment. Germany was being asked to pay for the First World War until nearly the end of the 20th century. Over that period, with interest, total payments would have come to roughly 112 billion Reichsmarks. The average annual payment was set at approximately 2 billion Reichsmarks. But here's the deeper problem. Germany's entire economic recovery was now completely dependent on American capital. The country had become addicted to foreign loans. Its banks, its industries, its municipal governments, all of them were running on borrowed American money. And nobody seemed to ask the obvious question, what happens if that money stops flowing? On October 29, 1929, the answer arrived with the force of an earthquake. The New York Stock Exchange crashed. The Great Depression had begun. Almost overnight, American banks stopped lending and started calling in their existing loans. The capital that had been propping up the German economy evaporated. Banks that had been lending freely suddenly demanded repayment from institutions that had no ability to pay. The dominoes fell in rapid succession. German banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. Industrial production plummeted. And unemployment, which had been relatively manageable during the so-called golden years, exploded. By the end of 1929, roughly 1.3 to 1.8 million Germans were out of work. By 1932, that number had rocketed to nearly 6 million. 1 out of every 3 working-age Germans was unemployed. In some industrial cities, the rate was even higher. Entire families were destitute. Soup kitchens overflowed. Crime in Berlin surged, with arrests for theft jumping by 24%. Homelessness became epidemic, and makeshift shanty towns sprouted on the outskirts of major cities. Young men, especially those between 16 and 30, were hit hardest. Half of them were unemployed. An entire generation was growing up with no job, no prospects, and no faith in the system. And this is the point in the story where the standard narrative usually jumps straight to Hitler's rise to power. But there's a crucial chapter in between that rarely gets told, and it involves some of the most recognizable names in American and British finance and industry. You see, even as Germany was collapsing, powerful interests on Wall Street and in the City of London saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. The industrial infrastructure of Germany, even battered as it was, represented enormous potential, and certain financiers and corporations understood that a recovering Germany, especially one with a strong authoritarian government willing to rearm, would be an incredibly profitable partner. The most critical relationship was between Standard Oil of New Jersey, the predecessor of what we now know as ExxonMobil, and a German chemical conglomerate called IG Farben. IG Farben was enormous. It was the largest chemical company in the world, and its products were woven into every aspect of German industry, from dyes and pharmaceuticals to explosives and synthetic materials. In 1929, Standard Oil and IG Farben entered into what Farben's own internal documents described as a marriage. Under this arrangement, Standard Oil shared its proprietary technology for producing synthetic gasoline through a process called hydrogenation, turning coal into liquid fuel. In exchange, IG Farben gave Standard Oil rights over chemical production in the United States. This might sound like an ordinary corporate partnership, but the implications were staggering. Germany had virtually no natural oil reserves. Without fuel, it couldn't run a modern military. The hydrogenation process that Standard Oil helped develop and finance gave Germany the ability to manufacture its own gasoline from its abundant coal deposits. Congressional investigations after the war, including the Truman Committee, concluded that this technology transfer was critical to Germany's ability to wage war. Without synthetic fuel, the Luftwaffe could not have flown. Without synthetic rubber, German tanks would not have rolled. And it didn't stop there. Standard Oil also provided IG Farben with the patents and expertise to manufacture tetraethyl lead, a critical additive for high-octane aviation fuel. Without this compound, the German Air Force simply could not have operated its advanced aircraft at the speeds and altitudes needed for modern warfare. What makes this even more disturbing is what happened with synthetic rubber. Under the partnership agreement, IG Farben had exclusive rights over synthetic rubber production globally, while Standard Oil held a monopoly in the United States. When the war began and America desperately needed its own synthetic rubber program, Standard Oil actively delayed its development to protect the terms of its cartel agreement with Farben. This deliberate obstruction was exposed during wartime Senate investigations and became a national scandal. But Standard Oil wasn't alone. The broader pattern of American corporate involvement with the German war machine extended across multiple industries. The Dawes Plan and Young Plan didn't just restructure reparations. They created a pipeline for American capital to flow directly into German industrial cartels. J.P. Morgan, Dillon Reed, and National City Bank floated enormous loans that funded the expansion of companies like IG Farben, Vereinigte Stahlwerke, the United Steelworks, and other industrial giants that would later form the backbone of German rearmament. There was also a key individual who served as a bridge between Wall Street and the Nazi regime. His name was Hjalmar Schacht, and he is one of the most consequential and least discussed figures of the 20th century. Schacht was a financial genius. He had previously worked for the Equitable Trust Company in New York and had deep relationships with American and British banking circles. In 1923, he was appointed president of the Reichsbank and is credited with ending the hyperinflation crisis by introducing the Rentenmark, a temporary currency backed by mortgages on German agricultural and industrial land. But Schacht's most significant contribution came later. After falling out with the Weimar establishment, he became an early and vocal supporter of the Nazi Party. He used his international credibility and his network of contacts in New York and London to arrange financing for Hitler's movement. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Schacht was reappointed as president of the Reichsbank and later became Minister of Economics. In these roles, he designed the financial architecture that made German rearmament possible, creating a shadow system of financing through instruments called Mefo bills, essentially secret IOUs backed by a shell company, that allowed Germany to spend massively on weapons without the spending showing up in the official government budget. And Schacht maintained his Wall Street connections throughout. The financial elites who had lent to Germany under the Dawes and Young plans didn't suddenly cut ties when the Nazis came to power. If anything, the relationships deepened. The Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, established in 1930 in Basel, Switzerland, ostensibly to manage reparation payments, became a quiet meeting ground where representatives of the Reichsbank, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve continued to do business even during the war itself. Directors from these ostensibly enemy institutions sat together on the BIS board throughout the conflict. Now, I want to be careful here. It's important to distinguish between documented historical connections and conspiratorial speculation. Not everyone who did business with Germany intended to enable a war. Many of these corporate relationships were formed before the Nazis came to power, when Germany was still a democracy. And the full horror of what the Nazi regime would become was not immediately apparent to everyone. But what is documented through congressional testimony, declassified documents, and corporate records is that a significant number of powerful American and British financial interests continued to profit from their German partnerships long after the nature of the regime was clear. And those partnerships provided technology, capital, and industrial capacity that were essential to Germany's ability to wage the war. The other pillar of the standard narrative that deserves closer scrutiny is appeasement, the diplomatic strategy pursued by Britain and France throughout the 1930s. The traditional story says that British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was a naive fool who handed Hitler everything he wanted at the Munich conference in September 1938. And while Chamberlain certainly miscalculated, the reality is far more complicated than simple naivety. Appeasement wasn't born from weakness of character, it was born from trauma. The generation of leaders who sat in Parliament and the French National Assembly in the 1930s had lived through the First World War. Many had served in the trenches themselves. They had seen what modern industrial warfare looked like, the mud, the gas, the machine guns, the trenches filled with rotting bodies, and they were absolutely viscerally determined to avoid it ever happening again. When Chamberlain spoke of peace for our time, he wasn't being foolish. He was expressing the desperate hope of an entire generation that had been broken by war. But there were also harder, more cynical calculations at work. Britain's military was not ready for another major conflict. The Royal Air Force was significantly behind the Luftwaffe in numbers and capability. British intelligence assessments in 1938 warned that Germany's Air Force could devastate London within days of a war beginning. The economic cost of rapid rearmament, coming on the heels of the Great Depression, was staggering, and the British Empire was already stretched thin, maintaining control over vast territories from India to Africa to the Middle East. France was in an even worse position, politically divided between left and right, economically weakened, and militarily invested in a purely defensive strategy built around the Maginot Line, a fortified wall along the German border that was militarily impressive but strategically inflexible, France was in no condition to confront Germany alone. And the one power that might have made a difference, the United States, was deep in its isolationist phase, with Congress having passed a series of neutrality acts specifically designed to keep America out of European conflicts. So when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, violating the Treaty of Versailles, Britain and France did nothing. When he announced the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, in March 1938, they did nothing. And when he demanded the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia, they agreed to give it to him at Munich without even inviting the Czechoslovak government to the negotiating table. Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time. A British opinion poll taken shortly after the conference showed 57% of the public was satisfied with his actions. People were relieved. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to believe that appeasement would work, but it didn't work. And arguably, many people at the time already knew it wouldn't. Winston Churchill, still a backbencher in Parliament, warned that Britain had been given a choice between war and dishonor, and having chosen dishonor, would get war. He was right. Within 6 months, Hitler tore up the Munich Agreement, marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, and installed a puppet government in Prague. The strategy of appeasement lay in ruins. And yet, even after the fall of Czechoslovakia, the pattern of accommodation continued. Britain issued a guarantee to Poland, pledging to defend it if Germany attacked, but made no serious military preparations to actually follow through. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Britain and France did declare war. But for the first several months, the conflict was so quiet on the Western Front that journalists called it the phony war. French troops sat behind the Maginot Line. British forces in France dug in and waited. Nobody seemed willing to actually fight. There's something deeply important to understand here, and it's the thread that ties everything together. The Second World War was not caused by a single factor. It was caused by a cascade of failures, each one making the next more likely, each one creating the conditions for the catastrophe that followed. The Treaty of Versailles created a Germany that was economically crippled and psychologically humiliated, but not actually weakened enough to be unable to recover. As many historians have noted, it was the worst of both worlds. Too harsh to allow reconciliation, too lenient to prevent resurgence. It was, as one commentator described it, punitive enough to cause resentment, but not punitive enough to prevent rearmament. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the savings and the trust of the German middle class, the very people who should have been the backbone of Weimar democracy. The Dawes and Young plans created a dangerous dependency on American capital, so that when the Great Depression hit, Germany was thrown into the worst economic crisis of any Western nation, with unemployment peaking at over 30% and 6 million people out of work by early 1933. That economic devastation drove voters away from moderate parties and toward extremes. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazi Party went from a fringe movement with 12 seats in the Reichstag to the second largest party in Germany with 107 seats. Their vote count leaped from roughly 800,000 to 6.4 million in just 2 years. And by July 1932, they were the largest party in the German parliament with 230 seats. This astronomical rise wasn't powered by ideology alone. It was powered by donations from German industrialists like Fritz Thyssen, the steel and coal baron, and Emil Kerdorf, who poured money into the Nazi Party because they saw it as a bulwark against communism and a path to the destruction of organized labor. Meanwhile, Wall Street capital had already built the industrial infrastructure that would be repurposed for war. American loans had modernized German steel mills, chemical plants, and factories. American technology had given Germany the ability to produce synthetic fuel and rubber. American and British financial institutions had maintained their profitable relationships with German industry, even as that industry was being militarized. And throughout the 1930s, as Hitler systematically dismantled the Versailles settlement, rebuilt Germany's military, and expanded its borders, the democratic powers did almost nothing to stop him. Not because they didn't know what was happening, but because they were too scarred, too divided, too economically weakened, and in some cases too financially invested to act. There's a broader pattern here that extends beyond Europe. While Britain and France were appeasing Hitler, the League of Nations had already failed to stop Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 went effectively unpunished. The Spanish Civil War, from 1936 to 1939, became a rehearsal for the broader conflict, with Germany and Italy backing Franco while the democracies officially stayed neutral. Every time an aggressive power tested the international system and the international system blinked, the lesson was reinforced. There would be no consequences. The rules didn't apply. The world order that had been established after the First World War was a fiction. And so when German troops crossed the Polish border at dawn on September 1st, 1939, it wasn't really a surprise. It was the logical conclusion of 20 years of compounding failures. 20 years of a peace treaty that created more problems than it solved, 20 years of economic manipulation, corporate greed, political cowardice, and willful blindness. The standard version of history asks you to believe that the Second World War was caused by one evil man and his evil ideology. And that's partly true. Hitler's fanaticism, his willingness to wage total war, his genocidal ambitions, these were real and they were monstrous. But they didn't emerge from nothing. They grew in soil that had been carefully, almost methodically prepared. The men who wrote the Treaty of Versailles prepared that soil when they chose punishment over reconciliation. The bankers who structured the Dawes and Young plans prepared it when they created an economy built on borrowed money and circular debt. The industrialists who transferred critical military technology to German corporations prepared it when they chose profits over principles. The diplomats who practiced appeasement prepared it when they traded the sovereignty of smaller nations for the illusion of peace. And the populations of the democratic nations prepared it when they chose to look away because looking was too painful. The Second World War killed between 70 and 85 million people. It produced the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and a Cold War that defined the next half-century. And the uncomfortable truth is that its causes cannot be reduced to a single villain or a single ideology. Its causes were systemic, they were economic, they were political. And many of the institutions and incentive structures that allowed it to happen didn't disappear after 1945. They adapted, they rebranded, and in many cases, they're still with us. The lesson of how the Second World War really began isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning. It's a reminder that great catastrophes don't happen because one person wills them into existence. They happen because systems fail. Because people at every level, from presidents and bankers to ordinary citizens, make choices based on short-term comfort rather than long-term consequence. Because the easy explanation, the one that blames everything on a single monster, is always more attractive than the complicated truth, which is that the monster could never have risen without the architecture of failure that was built around him. And if you understand that, if you really understand that, then you understand something not just about 1939, but about the world you're living in right now. If this story changed the way you think about history, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me keep making content like this. I'll see you in the next one.